Thursday evening, after I put the finishing touches on the sermon, I went out for a walk, grabbed the prayer cards. I thought, I'll pray for the church, and started walking. I was about 10 minutes into my walk when my phone rang. I got the most painful phone call I've ever received in my life. One of the dear sisters in our church went to be with Jesus at age 14. She took her own life, although I'm convinced at this point it was an accident. One of the sweetest, happiest, most delightful faces in our church over the last 4 years we're no longer going to see now. If you'll indulge me, I have to say the sermon that I prepared is just not what's on my heart today. I was excited to get back into Peter, but I just thought as a church it would be good to think through what the Word of God says about times like this. Why would God let something like this happen? Why? One of Megan's favorite verses is Romans 8:28, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. There's a lot of tragedies you can look at and examine and see, oh, I could see how that could be a good thing. But this? A beautiful, happy 14-year-old girl dying this way? And the horrific agony and pain that her family and friends are going to have to suffer for the rest of their lives now? How could this possibly be good? If only we could know what she was thinking. If there were just a note, or something on her Facebook page or in her diary or a comment to a friend, something to give us an idea of what was going through her mind at the time so we could know why. How could it possibly be a good thing for us not to know that? When a bitter calamity strikes like it did on Thursday, everything in us just wants to reject it, right? Just when you lose a loved one in some horrible way, or you endure an assault or some abuse, or you contract some deadly disease, those huge, massive kinds of calamities, when they come crashing into our lives, our natural reaction is just, no, this can't be real, this can't be happening. We don't want to accept it, but reality forces its way in on us, and we are left reeling with thoughts about how wrong it is, how absurd, how meaningless, how undeserved. It just baffles our sense of justice and rightness and the way things should be. One of our most important jobs, we believe, as leaders in the church and teachers, is to preach and to pray in such a way so that when calamity strikes in your life, you do not curse God. It's one of our goals as a church. And not just that you do not curse Him, but that you worship Him. And I'm not talking about forced, contrived, outside only, keep a stiff upper lip kind of worship. I'm talking about true, genuine, heartfelt expression of delight and trust and hope in God. That's what we want you to be like as a church. And so far, so good. What happened Friday night? I don't know. I think most of you were here. It's an amazing thing. Sam just sends out an email on Friday morning. Idea he gets, impromptu prayer meeting tonight at church in inclement weather. And the whole church shows up. We had chairs set up all the way to the back. The place was packed and everybody's here. And people just began praying and for over an hour, just straight prayers and worship. And I think what happened was the hearts of God's people offered some of the truest and deepest worship that's ever been offered in this place on Friday night. And that's a wonderful thing. That's an amazing response. That's great. That's a victory. But the test isn't over. God requires more of us than that. Our immediate response was excellent, but what we have to do now is respond in a godly way in the long term. We've been studying in 1 Peter about suffering for doing what's good. Suffering while doing right. Everything that we've learned about that, would this count as that kind of suffering? Does losing a loved one count as undeserved suffering? Unjust suffering? Absolutely it does. What happened Thursday didn't happen because of some sin that we were committing. Hundreds of you were out doing all kinds of godly, righteous, good things on Thursday, only to come home and hear this horrible news. Losing a loved one is definitely in the category of unjust suffering, and so everything that Peter has been saying in chapter 2 applies, including the part about it being especially commendable before God if you endure it in a godly way. Because it brings glory and honor and praise to God when we respond to something like this with worship rather than with cursing or even with questioning. And no book teaches us how to do that like the book of Job. The book starts out with Job's remarkable godliness. He was absolutely blameless. And then out of nowhere comes this unthinkable calamity. Job didn't just lose one 14-year-old daughter. He lost 3 daughters and 7 sons, all 10 of his children, all at once. On top of that, he lost all his wealth. And he contracted this horrible, painful disease with open sores that became contaminated and infected with worms. The grief and the pain and the sorrow and anguish in his heart must have been absolutely unimaginable. Just so sudden, out of nowhere, so undeserved and unexpected and unjust. And then the writer gives us a glimpse of something that Job never got to see, and that you never get to see any other time except here. The whole book of Job is crying out, why, God, why is this happening? And the book actually starts right out telling us why. We get to know the reader knows why. Job never does, not even at the end. At the very end, when God finally talks to Job and restores him, he still never tells him why. He still never gets to see what we see at the beginning. But just this once, God lets us peek into heaven and see the answer to the question, why, in this case. And it's an answer that you would never dream of. I mean, if you're trying to piece together why some horrible thing happened in your life, this is probably the last thing that you would naturally think of as an explanation. In fact, even though it's in the Bible, even still today, we probably don't think very often, oh, maybe it's this. Job had no idea, but here's what happened. In verses 6 to 12, there's a meeting in heaven between God and Satan. In verse 7, Satan says that he was spending his time going to and fro on the earth. Where have you been, Satan? Oh, I've just been wandering back and forth on the earth. And then God just puts on display a trophy. This man that he so delights in. He says, have you considered my servant Job? There's nobody like him on the earth. He fears God and shuns evil. Why does God bring that up? I mean, if you're Job, I don't know if Job ever got to read the book of Job, for it was written after his death, but if he did get to read it, when he got to this part, he's thinking, God, brag about something else. I mean, this is like an owner of a jewelry store who's in his store, and all of a sudden this famous diamond thief comes into the store, and the owner says, what are you doing? And the thief says, oh, I'm just walking to and fro in your store, looking around. And the owner says, well, did you see the one up front? Because that's our biggest one. It's worth $1 million. Why would you say that to a diamond thief? I mean, we can rule out that God is foolish or he doesn't know what's going on, right? The only thing that leaves us with is God is setting this up on purpose. God knows exactly what's going to happen. Why is he doing this? He's doing it because it is so important to God to expose the strength and beauty of Job's faith. God is just like Jesus was. Every time Jesus saw faith, he immediately wanted to put an obstacle in front of that person to expose that faith. He wanted to expose it. Why? Why is it so important for God to expose Job's faith is important because Job's faith puts on display the trustworthiness and goodness and power of God. When somebody says, oh, I love God, I trust God, I worship God, I'm a believer, everything, that may be real, it may not be real. But if they're still saying that after they lose everything, it's real. And Satan here is banking on the fact that it's not real in Job's case. He's banking on that theory. Basically, he says to God, the only reason Job worships you is because you buy him off. Of course he's going to worship you if everything's sweet and light in his life. Bed of roses. Of course, I mean, he's got this wonderful family. He's got all this money. He's got health. He's got everything. Of course, why wouldn't he worship you? You take that away, he'll curse you to your face. Verse 11, stretch out your hand, strike everything he has. He will surely curse you to your face, God, because you are not worthy to be worshipped just in and of yourself. That's what Satan's getting at. You do not deserve worship just because of being God, just because of who you are. You have to bribe it out of people. And at that point, God could have said, look, Satan, I don't need to prove myself to you or anybody else. I know my servant Job. I know his heart. That's enough for me. And been done with it. He could have said that. In fact, he usually says that, I believe. But in this case, God chooses to decide, go ahead and get an open victory right in front of everybody and to show his glory before Satan. So God gives Satan the green light. Go ahead and smite Job. And the devil unleashes his vicious, evil, malicious attack on Job and kills all Job's children, takes away his wealth and his health and everything else. And so one thing we learn right away in this book, this very important principle, is this. Satan's work is ultimately the work of the Lord. It's very important to understand. The person who hurt you, who abused you, who took something away from you, that person's work is ultimately the work of God. It's God's doing. That person was accomplishing evil. God was accomplishing good. God says to Satan in verse 6, very well then, he's in your power. Then in verse 7, it's very explicit. Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job. Satan did it. It was Satan's doing. And then in verse 10, Job says, shall we accept good? In chapter 2, verse 10, shall we accept good from God and not trouble? Job is saying God did it. And the very next verse says, he's right. Don't criticize Job for this. He's right. Job looks right past the evil men who came and attacked. He looked right past the weather, the storm, looked right past the devil, looked past all that, looked all the way up to the original, ultimate, first source, God, the source that matters. That's the only source that mattered to Job. Were all those other secondary agents real sources of what happened? Yeah, they were. But Job's not concerned about that. He wants to focus on the most important source, God. And he's exactly right to think that way. The writer affirms that twice. You know, there are a lot of messed up beliefs in the book of Job. People who have some bad theology in the book of Job. The friends putting God in a box and saying he could never afflict a good man. Job eventually doubting God's justice and goodness. Plenty of examples in the book of Job of people going way off track theologically in various ways. But there's one mistake that nobody in the book of Job makes. And that is, nobody ever doubts the fact that tragedies that come into our lives come from the hand of God. Everybody understands that in Job. I mean, nobody questions that. Not the friends, not Job, not Elihu, not even Job's wife gets mixed up on that. They all understand that. That's just so basic. The only reason you ever hear today people confused on that, today people saying ridiculous things like, oh, God had nothing to do with that. The only reason anybody ever says something like that today is because we're affected by the twisted, depraved naturalism of our culture. We live in a culture that thinks it's explained God away because it discovered gravity and named it. They think that the observations of science explain everything, and so we no longer need God. We've got everything figured out. Observations of science. Observations of science explain nothing because they're just that, observations. They're just watching what God does and coming up with long, technical Latin names for it all. It doesn't explain anything. The fact that they see it and name it doesn't even begin to explain some of the most basic, obvious questions like, What powers gravity? No idea. Our world lives in the insanity of the illusion that Mother Nature somehow just created herself and powers herself. And that insanity affects people in the church, even to the point where we imagine that there are some things that happen that are actually not in God's control. That wouldn't even occurred to people in the time of Job. People hadn't fallen that far into depravity yet. And even the most simple-minded people then understood that God controls all things. Psalm 135:6, the Lord does whatever He pleases in the heavens and on the earth and in the seas and in all their depths. So all these horrors that break into Job's life all at once, Job is thinking, what in the world is going on? And the answer is, that's not even the right question. The issue isn't what in the world. It's something going on in heaven. What's going on in the world isn't even the issue. What's going on in heaven is there's a major accusation that has been made in heaven. Satan is saying that essentially God is of no value. What Satan is saying is if a man loses everything he has in the world and all he's got left is God, then he's got nothing. That's what Satan's saying, which means God is worthless. That's the accusation the devil is making, and that's the accusation, that's the doctrine that Satan is trying to convince all of us of every day. That's his message. That's what he wants to convince us. That's the lie he's trying to tell us every day, and he does it two ways. He does it through pain and he does it through pleasure. When pain comes in your life, Satan says, you've lost everything, all you've got left is God, you have nothing left. What you have left is not enough. You might as well fall into despair. That's what happens with pain. And when pleasure comes into our life, Satan gives us the same message. He says, see how satisfying this is? See? That's where joy comes from. That's where satisfaction comes from, not from God. This is Job's message. It always has been. And he tries to say that in heaven. And so this is a massive showdown in heaven where Satan is making this huge accusation and God is about to call his bluff on it and put it to the test. And it all comes down to how Job responds. And so verse 21 records the victory. These are the words that have, I think, probably brought more tears to more eyes over the centuries than any other sentence ever spoken. Job 1:21, Job said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord has given, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And 10 million angels' arms flew up into the air, and praise erupted in heaven, and the victory was won. And Satan was thundered out of there by the praises of the angels, no doubt. And when Megan was taken away in such a sudden, horrible way, and Janae and the boys, the next day were not cursing God, but were blessing Him. 1 million angels' arms flew up into the air, and there was a thunderous victory in heaven, and Satan was driven out. This is why he pointed to his choice diamond and set that up for this victory. To show that God is worthy of praise, He's worthy of honor and glory and trust. Even if you take everything away, He's worth more than everything else. God does not have to buy our worship or bribe for it. He's worthy of it even if He takes everything away from us. Though He slay me, yet will I trust in Him. Worthy is our God to receive power and wealth and wisdom and glory and strength and honor and thanks. He's worthy of it, no matter what happens to us. A single little suffering saint who continues to worship God even after losing what's most precious in the world is a cosmic victory in heaven. From Thursday night to today, Janae and the boys showed God to be more valuable than even their dear daughter and sister. That's how much they were able to honor God because of this loss. You see, they are honoring God in a way now that someone who's not suffering can't honor God. The more this whole thing stings you, the more it hurts, the greater your capacity to honor God by continuing to praise Him instead of curse Him. You see that? This is the value of pain. This is the value of loss. It gives you greater capacity to show Him worthy. So like Janae and Eric and Ryan, Job wins the initial battle decisively. And he also wins round 2 and round 3, as you heard in the reading. But after that comes another test. You might think that after chapter 2, after Job, he gets all 3 of these huge calamities and tests and everything, and he has such a wonderful response, godly worship. You'd think the next thing would be, you just skip right to chapter 42, and God brings Job's trial to an end, and He rewards him and restores him, and everything's good. That doesn't happen. The ordeal's not over. Job now has to face the long, dark valley of pain that just went on and on and on and on. And to make matters worse, the whole time he's got these comforters who are constantly accusing him, falsely accusing him. And we all know how much that hurts, especially when people start saying the death of your children is your fault. And he has to deal with that on top of everything else, and it's those false accusations that seem to eventually wear him down, and Job eventually slips and starts questioning God's justice and goodness. That goes on for 35 chapters. I think God's teaching us something in the fact that happens for 35 chapters. That valley is long. It just goes and goes and goes. Well, let's fast forward past it. Let's skip to chapter 38. Clouds begin to gather as Elihu is speaking, and it starts storming. Elihu wraps it up. And out of that storm, God speaks. Verse 1, chapter 38, verse 1. Then Yahweh answered Job out of the storm. He said, "Who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man, and I will question you, and you shall answer me." That's kind of a harsh way to talk to a guy who has just been crushed with the kind of sorrow and hardship that Job has experienced, don't you think? It's harsh. It's harsh. It's like a doctor putting your arm back in its socket. I mean, that shoving it back into place, into joint, that hurts, but it's an act of kindness. It's a violent motion that is necessary because of how far out of joint Job really is here. God is normally very tender and gentle and patient and compassionate with people suffering like Job, but Job has questions His goodness and His justice, and that's got to be rebuked. That has to be handled right away. Once you start questioning God's goodness, you are on a track that will lead to absolute destruction, and so it is critical that it be dealt with decisively to save Job's life. And so now, after the course of the next over the course of the next 4 chapters, God is going to solve Job's grief problem. He's going to give Job what he needs. He's going to solve his problem. But He's not going to bring Job comfort and strength in the way that Job wants. He's going to bring him comfort and strength, but He doesn't do it in the way that Job would want or that we always want. We always want to know the answer to the question, why? Just tell me why. God, just give me an explanation. Give me an account for what you've done, God. We always think we would be so much better off if God would just reveal the things that He has chosen to hide from us. We want God to give us an account so that we can pass judgment on whether or not He's done the right thing, right? He's done what's best. We need to make our assessment of that. That's what we want. But God knows better. He knows that what we really need is not that information. That's not what we need. It feels like what we need. It feels like it would help just to know. That's not what we need. What we need is to understand how capable and how powerful and how good and how wise God is, and that He can be trusted to do what's best. Imagine the world's most skilled brain surgeon. He's doing surgery on your child, and you're watching, and he makes a certain incision, and you say, hey, why did you cut right there that way? Tell me why. And he knows he could give you a 3-hour lecture on why that incision is made that way. You still wouldn't even begin to understand without a whole history and medical training. And so instead of answering your question about the incision, he just gives you his credentials as the world's greatest brain surgeon. And he does that because he knows that'll do far more to help you with your anxiety than giving you an explanation of this incision. It's exactly what's happening here. Job has all these why questions for God, and God responds by answering none of them. None of them. Instead, God takes the opportunity to just present His resume. That's what this is. If you want to put a title in your Bible over chapters 38 through 41, you can just write God's resume. Because that's what He's doing. He's just giving His credentials. So let's just spend the rest of our time this morning focusing on our Lord's credentials and see if we can get to the point where we trust that God made the right decision about the timing and the circumstances of the beginning and the ending of Megan's earthly life, and every calamity that you have ever faced, that you are facing now, or you ever will face. See if we can get so we can just trust Him on all that. God starts His resume here in verse 4, talking about the earth. He says, "Where were you, Job, when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Or who laid its cornerstone while all the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy?" Some of you look like you're pretty old out there. Been around a while. Can you think back? Can you remember day one of the creation when God laid the foundation of the earth? Raise your hand if you can remember that. Would you agree with me that if you're going to be giving advice on how to run things, you should at least have been around for that? Next comes verse 8. You notice God is not just giving His resume here, He's comparing His resume to Job's resume. Verses 8 to 11, or He's calling on Job to do that. Verse 8, "Who shut up the sea behind doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness? When I fixed limits for it and set its doors and bars in place? When I said, 'This far you may come and no farther, this is where your proud waves halt.'" Anyone who's going to be qualified to give advice to God should at least be able to create an ocean and move it around at will. Then in verses 12 to 15, he talks about the dawn. Just let yourself think about our great God as we go through this. The dawn. If you are so wise and so powerful that you're in a position to question God, then you should at least be able to create mornings. Make a sunrise. God does that every single day. Piece of cake for Him. Anyone who's a counselor to God should be able to easily move around stars and planets. Or create light. Right? I mean, that's pretty basic, right? Just light. You ever think much about light? How much wisdom does it take to invent light? I don't know if you've ever studied it. We could just go on and on about this. I had to kind of rein myself in a little bit, but did you know that the only reason that the world can exist is because light behaves in ways that we can't possibly explain, that don't seem to even follow the rules of physics? For example, light, you've heard the speed of light is 186,000 meters per second, right? Meters? Miles. Miles per second. Don't listen to last night's tape. I think I said meters. 186,000 miles per second. If you're in a car traveling at 50 miles an hour, and somebody's coming up behind you at 70, you look in your rearview mirror, you see them gaining on you at the rate of 20 miles an hour, right? Because they're going 20 faster. If they're going 20 slower, then they back off. If you are in a parked car and there's light coming from behind you, it's coming at the rate, it's gaining on you at 186,000 miles per second. If you are traveling at 180,000 miles per second, the light is still gaining on you at 186,000 miles per second. That does not make any sense. Also, there's a connection between the speed of light and time. And I don't know how they figured that out, but they did. Mathematically, they figured it out. The closer you get to the speed of light, the slower time passes for you. That was discovered mathematically, but they've actually proved it in experiments. You get two identical atomic clocks, put one on the ground, one on an airplane, fly that plane around, land it, and they'll be off because the one was moving. Time actually goes slower the faster you move. So if you have two twins and you put one on a rocket and it's flying at close to the speed of light for 10 years and comes back to Earth, then when it comes back, the one who was on the rocket would feel like it's only been a few moments, and he would actually be 10 years younger than his brother. And if you go at the speed of light, then it goes to zero. The time passing goes to zero, which means if you could ride on a photon, a photon travels through space millions of miles, and it arrives, from its perspective, it arrives at its destination at the very same moment that it left its origin. It is created and is absorbed at the same moment, which means from the perspective of the photon, it goes into existence and goes out of existence at the same moment, which to me says it never existed. And it had traveled through space. Now, also, the universe, in order to function, light has to behave this way. And it also has to behave sometimes as a particle and not a wave, and sometimes as a wave and not a particle. And if I were in charge of light, that would be a big problem. It's not a problem for God. He just made light that way. That's right there in his resume. Then comes verse 16 to 18. God focuses on the depth and the breadth of the sea and the land. Let's think about the sea. I mean, we can't even begin to explore the sea. He said, Job, you've never even been to the bottom of the sea. How could you possibly think you know enough information to argue with God? And this is all the easy stuff. We're all still down on earth. Verse 19, we launch up into the heavens. What is the way to the abode of the light, and where does darkness reside? Can you take them to their places? Do you know the paths to their dwellings? Surely you know, for you were already born, Job. You have lived so many years. Then in verses 22 to 30, God asks him about the snow and the rain and the hail and the frost. Do you know anything about how to store up hail for the day of battle, Job? Are you good at that? Could you cut a channel in the sky to make it rain on a land where no man lives? Because, Job, I do that every day. Lift your eyes even higher, Job. Look at the constellations. You move those around? Or is moving the stars a little bit too big for you? Because they're puny compared to me, God says. The kinds of things that God does with his fingers in the heavens are beyond imagination. I mean, it's just staggering. There was an explosion that happened right here in our Milky Way galaxy that became visible to Earth in the year 1054. That explosion was visible from Earth. You could see it in the daylight for 23 days. And at night, you could see it for almost 2 years after the explosion. You can see the wreckage of this explosion. To this day, even now, 1,000 years later, it can be seen with a telescope. They call it the Crab Nebula, the wreckage of this explosion. They call it the Crab Nebula, and it's still expanding at the rate of 700 miles per second. The cloud of wreckage from that explosion right now is 10 light years across. And if you're not familiar with light years, that means if we take the universe and reduce it down, shrink it down to the tiny little scale, so if the Earth is right here, the moon is a half inch away, the sun is about 15 feet over there, the Crab Nebula would cover the United States. This is how massive the things. The Crab Nebula is a tiny blip in the galaxy. You can't even see it if you back off and look at the galaxy. And our galaxy is a point of light among millions and billions of other galaxies. And the psalmist says all of that is a work of his fingers. Psalm 8:3. He made it all. Every star, every grain of sand, every galaxy, every molecule, every animal, every insect, everything. Can you do that? Because if you're going to offer advice to God, how about lightning? Do you know how to whistle for the lightning and have it snap to attention? Say, here we are. Obey you. Can you count the clouds with your wisdom? If you're going to question God, God should be able to, you should easily be able to do this stuff. These are the kinds of things that God could do in his sleep, if he slept, which he doesn't. See what God is doing here? He's saying, Job, I think I'm capable of running the universe without your help. God does not have to report to us. He does not have to give an account to us. We don't need to micromanage God by looking over his shoulder and second-guessing and demanding explanations for what he does. And if we imagine that we do need to know the answers, it is loving for God to withhold those answers from us, to shake us out of that illusion, thinking that knowing what he's hidden matters to us. It does not. It would only matter, we would only need to know this information if God couldn't be fully trusted and we had to supervise him. Can we all just be humble enough to admit that whether we focus on the earth or the sea or the dawn or the snow or the hail or the constellations or the rain, whatever you look at, we all just come up completely ignorant and impotent compared to God. We can't even begin to run those things. In verse 39, God turns to the animals. Who provides the animals with all their food every day? Could you take care of all the animals? Do you even know how many different kinds of animals there are and where they are at this moment? Because God feeds every one of them every day. He's feeding them right now. Let's just take one kind of animals. Remember when we talked about the birds and when we went through the Sermon on the Mount? You know how many birds God has to feed today before the sun goes down? Between 2 and 400 billion. 2 and 400 billion birds. Now, if that were your job, you would have to come up with 100 million tons of food every day, and then get it all distributed all around the world, just for the birds. And that's not even counting all the other 1.2 million species of animals. And it's not just feeding either. It's all the other care that God takes of them. Here in Job, he talks about the birth, the mountain goat giving birth. Every time any animal gives birth anywhere on the planet, God is there to help. God's on top of that. He's on top of everything. Think of all the coordination of all of the systems. The system of our sun and its surface and gravity and warmth and light and heat and thermonuclear fusion and all of that perfectly interlocked with the Earth's hydrology system and the system of the animal kingdom and the animals dependent on other animals for their existence and the ecosystems of the rivers and the systems of humanity and society and the moon and its tides and the rotation and the revolution of the earth and the atmosphere and oxygen and trees and animals and the interdependence of the complex ecosystems of deserts and lakes and coral reefs and mountains and rainforests and ice caps and tundra and wetlands, each one incredibly complex, each functioning together globally. God keeps all that in his head. He calculates all that easier than you can figure 2 plus 2. And while he does all that, he's also keeping all the cells of every living thing up and running, which is an amazing thing. Just to give you an idea, you take the simplest little cell that there is. It's a blue-green algae. It's about as simple as it gets. It's not even really, it doesn't even have a nucleus, or it's not a complex cell at all. It just seems like a little blob. And yet, one bacteria of blue-green algae bacterium can synthesize some 3,000 to 6,000 compounds at a rate of 1 million reactions per second. That is a machine complex beyond anything man ever dreamed of inventing. That's just blue-green algae, and that's you take the simplest little blob of nothing in the creation, and it is complex beyond comprehension, and it becomes infinitely more complex when you move up from there to a human cell. And then you take the arrangement of billions of those into a human body. God's keeping it running, every single electron going. In chapter 39, God goes on to talk about his control over wild animals and his creation of the ostrich. Only God controls the wild animals. They answer only to him. He's the only one that controls them. And then he brings up the ostrich, which is, he points out the fact that it's so dumb. And he's in charge of that too. Verse 17, for God did not endow her with wisdom or give her a share of good sense. and yet when she spreads her feathers to run, she laughs at the horse and the rider. God makes fast things fast. He makes dumb things dumb. He makes smart things smart, weak things weak. Whether we consider the prey of the lions or the birth of the mountain goats or the freedom of the wild donkey or the insubordination of the wild ox or the stupidity of the ostrich or the might of the war horse or the flight of the hawk or the eagle, God controls it all. He talks about each one of these things. He controls all of it. And then finally in chapter 40, he takes a breath. God takes a breath and Job answers. Verse 4, I am unworthy. How could I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I'm sorry, I take it all back, God. But God isn't finished. He launches into a whole other chapter that focuses on the awesome power of his mighty arm and the thunder of his massive voice. Why? Why a whole nother chapter? It's because when you start questioning God's goodness and power and justice, that points to a life-threatening deficiency of three key nutrients in your soul. The nutrients of understanding God's power, understanding God's wisdom, and understanding God's goodness. And to make up for that deficiency, you have to take those three things in massive doses to recover. And so God keeps on going all the way to chapter 41, through chapter 41. If you truly believe that the maker of heaven and earth is an all-powerful, all-wise God who holds the universe in existence and guides it to a great climax, then at least one thing is for sure. There will be strangeness and mystery in the world beyond our little finite comprehension. That is a guarantee. I'm a sinner whose knowledge compared to God is statistically zero. And so if I believe in some God who always behaves exactly as I would predict, guess what? I've got a false God on my hand, for sure. If I got a God who does, everything he does makes perfect sense to my sinful, twisted, warped, teeny tiny little microscopic brain, you know for sure I'm dealing with a false God. If he's not any smarter than me, there is zero reason to think that God should run the world according to all our expectations. He is infinite. We are finite. He knows everything that can be known. I forget where I put my car keys. He's strong enough to wield galaxies. He never sleeps. I spend a third of my life flat on my back, unconscious. He's more glorious than all the Swiss Alps and the Grand Canyon and the Northern Lights and the Milky Way. And we have to spend a half hour in the morning just doing a lot of work to become presentable enough so we're not an eyesore. If God is really that much greater than us, that much wiser than us, that much more powerful, then of course he's going to do things that puzzle us routinely. Oh, the depth of the riches, the wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable his judgments and his past, beyond tracing out. Who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor? And yet, God has not left us in total ignorance, right? He has actually revealed to us all of the most important things. He has confided in us all of his grandest purposes in his word. But it's a good thing that he's also left us to trust him when it comes to things that are greater than our minuscule brains can comprehend. And it's mercy that he doesn't give us answers every time we want them, because if he did that, we would fall into depending on our own wisdom. And we would be in trouble because there's a lot of answers that we want to have that wouldn't be good for us to have. Don't spend your time trying to figure out what God has not revealed. That feels like the solution to your sorrow. It's not. The more you understand the truth of the wisdom, power, and goodness and trustworthiness of God, the more you will have comfort. And the more your response to crushing pain in life will be like Paul's in 2 Corinthians 1:9, who said, "Indeed, in our hearts we felt the sentence of death, but this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead." He's like, "Oh, I'm so glad for this crushing pain because it keeps me from the calamity of trusting myself." Let's just close by bringing it back around to 1 Peter 2. I'm going to ask the praise team to come back up on the platform because we want to sing about this at the end. I began the sermon by saying that any calamity that comes into your life, if it's not direct consequence of some specific sin, then it does fall into the category of suffering for good, suffering while doing good, right? And when we suffer while doing good, and we endure it without a sinful response, that is commendable before God. And so the question is that we've been wrestling with, how do you do that? And we're going to look in detail next week at how to do that, but the short answer is in 1 Peter 2:23, when they hurled their insults at Jesus, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, what did he do? He entrusted himself to him who judges justly. That's the key. That's how you handle calamity. You entrust yourself to the God who can be trusted. When some horror comes into your life and you feel yourself resisting, it's like, oh, no, this can't be happening. No. When that happens, stop resisting. Turn your attention away from that thing to the credentials of God listed in Job 38 through 41. Look at his resume. Just focus on that and say, God, I trust you. Did you know that even Jesus had to do that? Even Jesus, he had to entrust his situation to his Father when he faced undeserved suffering. He even had to do that. That's the path that Jesus took through life, and he left tracks that we might follow in his steps. When horrible things happen to you, you get abused, you get some terrible thing happens to you, your life hasn't gone off the rails. This isn't outside of God's plan. You're following in Jesus' steps. To this you are called, Peter says. This is your calling. Follow Jesus through pain. Why is that your calling? Why does he call us to that? Well, we're going to get a lot of answers to that next week, but for now, let's just keep our focus on God's resume, his goodness. Let's sing about that together.